The first snowflake of winter wasn't a whisper. It was a shiver down Ilara Vance's spine. It landed on the frozen mud of her porch, a harbinger of the brutal months to come. The wind, a biting, relentless force, whistled through the gaps in the cabin walls, a sound that had become the soundtrack to her despair. The sun had long since set, and the only light came from the flickering flame of the oil lamp, casting long, dancing shadows that made her small home feel even more vast and empty. Just a few months ago, this cabin had been a sanctuary. Her husband Thomas had built it with his own 2 hands, each log a testament to his love and his dreams for their future. Now it was just a cage, and she was the last bird trapped inside. The air was thin with the scent of pine and grief. "Mama, are we hungry?" a small voice asked from the corner. It was Liam, her son, no older than 5, wrapped in a blanket that was far too thin. His small round face was pale, his eyes wide and full of a hope that Ilara found increasingly difficult to sustain. She managed a weak smile, a practiced mask she wore to shield him from the harsh reality of their existence. "No, my sweet boy," she lied, her voice a soft hum. "We'll have a warm meal soon. You just rest now." He curled into a tighter ball, his faith in her absolute. Ilara looked at the small pile of flour and a few dried beans on the shelf. It wasn't enough for a meal, let alone to get them through the week. The last of their provisions were gone, and the hunting had been fruitless. She wasn't a hunter, not like Thomas was. He was the one who knew the trails, who could read the land and track the deer. She was a woman from the city, a stranger in a strange land, and now a widow. Her gaze drifted to the rifle propped against the wall. Thomas had taught her how to use it, but her hands still trembled when she held it. A few weeks ago, she had tried to hunt a rabbit, but the shot had gone wide and the creature had darted into the thicket, a blur of brown fur. She had just stood there, the rifle heavy in her hands, tears freezing on her cheeks. A loud knock on the door jolted her from her thoughts. It was a heavy, deliberate sound, not a friendly rap. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She glanced at the rifle, then back at Liam. He was already asleep, his little body curled up. She tiptoed to the door, peering through a small crack in the wood. A massive silhouette stood on her porch, framed by the swirling snow. It was Silas Thorne, the very man who had been a thorn in their side since Thomas's death. He was a brute of a man, with a cruel laugh and an ambition that knew no bounds. He wanted her land, and he was determined to get it, one way or another. "Ilara!" His voice boomed, muffled by the door. "I know you're in there. Don't be shy. I just came to check on my future property." A wave of fear and revulsion washed over her. She knew what he was capable of. He had already bought up all the neighboring ranches, and her small patch of land was the only one left, a tiny island in his sea of greed. "Go away, Silas," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Don't be foolish, woman. That boy of yours isn't going to last the winter, not on what you have. Sell me the land. I'll give you a fair price, enough to get you to the city where you belong." "This is my home," she said, her voice stronger now, "and it belongs to my son." "Suit yourself," he sneered, "but don't come crawling to me when your boy is half-starved. The winter is just beginning, and it's a long, lonely one for a woman on her own." His heavy footsteps crunched in the snow as he walked away, a bitter victory in his wake. Ilara leaned against the door, her body trembling. He was right. The winter was a beast, and she was no match for it. A single tear escaped her eye, tracing a path of fire down her cold cheek. The oil in the lamp was running low, and the flame flickered, a tiny pulse of life in the overwhelming darkness. She looked at Liam, at his innocent face, and a new kind of strength born of desperation surged through her. She couldn't give up. Not on him. She would find a way. She had to. The first chapter of her sorrow was over, but the story of her struggle was just beginning. The blizzard hit with a fury Ilara had never imagined possible. It wasn't just snow, it was a wall of white, driven by a wind that screamed like a banshee. The cabin groaned under the pressure, the logs trembling as if they were about to give way. She had barricaded the door with a chair and a heavy table, her fear of Silas replaced by a more immediate terror, the storm. For 2 days, they were prisoners. The fire in the hearth was a dying ember, the last of the kindling used. The air inside was frigid, and Liam was shivering uncontrollably despite being wrapped in every blanket they owned. His little body felt so cold, and his breathing was shallow. Ilara tried to get him to drink some water from a bucket, but his lips were cracked and dry. His eyes were half closed, and he murmured something about being hungry. A new wave of guilt and desperation washed over her. She had failed him. She should have left when Silas had offered. They could have been safe, warm and fed in the city, but the land, this home, was Thomas's legacy. It was all she had left of him. She held Liam close, her own body a shield against the cold. She tried to sing a lullaby, but her voice was hoarse, her throat aching with unshed tears. The lullaby dissolved into a silent prayer, a desperate plea to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. Just as the last flicker of the fire died, she heard it. A faint but persistent thudding against the cabin door, a rhythm unlike the howling wind. Her heart leaped into her throat. Was it Silas, returning to mock her, to gloat at their misery? She picked up the heavy iron poker from the cold hearth, her knuckles white. The thudding grew louder, more insistent. Then a voice deep and gruff cut through the noise of the storm. "Hello? Anyone in there? I see a wisp of smoke from the chimney. Are you alive?" Ilara froze. It wasn't Silas. The voice was deep, unfamiliar, and filled with a rough kind of concern. She hesitated, her hand still clutching the poker. It could be a trick. The West was full of opportunistic men who would take advantage of a woman alone. But the alternative, to stay here and watch Liam fade, was a fate she couldn't bear. She lowered the poker and slowly moved the table from the door, her heart pounding. The hinges groaned in protest as she carefully opened the door a sliver. The man who stood before her was a giant. He was cloaked in thick animal furs, and snow clung to his beard and hat, making him look like a mythical beast of the mountains. He was tall, powerfully built, his shoulders a formidable expanse. His eyes, a startling shade of green, were framed by a web of wrinkles from years spent squinting against the sun and snow. He held a large sack in one hand and a long rifle in the other. He didn't look like a threat. He looked like the mountain itself come to life. "I saw your chimney from a distance," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man of his size. "Thought I'd see if anyone needed help. Name's Jedediah Stone. Folks call me Jed." Ilara's gaze fell to her son, who was barely conscious. The cold was a physical presence, a clawing beast in the room. She was so desperate, so close to the end, that caution had become a luxury. "Please," she choked out, her voice raw with emotion. "My son, he's sick, we're starving." Jed's gaze softened. He looked past her, at the small boy shivering on the floor. His expression, which had been one of detached observation, transformed into one of profound sadness. He didn't ask questions, he didn't hesitate. He simply pushed the door open, his massive frame filling the doorway. "Move aside, ma'am," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Let's get that fire started." He knelt by the hearth, and with a swift, powerful motion pulled a bundle of dry kindling from his sack. He produced a piece of flint and a steel striker, and with a few sparks the dry wood caught fire. The flame danced to life, a small beacon of hope in the overwhelming cold. He then pulled out a small piece of dried meat and a loaf of hardtack from his bag. Ilara just watched, her mind reeling. This man, a stranger, a giant from the wilderness, had come in the nick of time, a living answer to her silent prayer. She looked at his face, at the way the firelight flickered in his green eyes. They held a deep, hidden pain, a world of sorrow she couldn't comprehend. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't look up from tending to the fire. "Just a man who got lost in a storm." He finally met her gaze, his expression unreadable, a strange mix of kindness and warning. "But I need you to understand something, Ilara Vance. You think you're in a world of trouble now, but I'm bigger than any trouble you've ever known." He paused, a single tear tracing a path down his weathered cheek. "I'm too big for your world, but I can't control myself." The words hung in the air, a cryptic and unsettling warning. But as he looked at Liam, a flicker of something she couldn't identify crossed his face. He quickly wiped away the tear, the moment of vulnerability gone as quickly as it had appeared. He was a paradox, a man of immense strength who carried an internal fragility, and for now he was their only hope. The scent of simmering stew filled the cabin, a scent so rich and foreign that Ilara felt a wave of dizziness. Jed had worked with a quiet, efficient grace that belied his size. He had pulled a small pot from his sack, along with dried meat, vegetables, and herbs he had foraged from who knows where. He had also produced a small pouch of tobacco, which he had crushed and mixed with water, forming a poultice that he applied to Liam's feverish forehead. "It's an old mountain remedy," he explained, his voice low. "Helps with the fever. We'll get him a bit of broth in him, and he'll be better soon." Ilara watched him, her mind trying to reconcile the image of the wild man who had warned her with the tender way he cared for her son. He was a puzzle, a man of contradictions. His hands, calloused and rough from years of manual labor, were surprisingly gentle as he checked Liam's pulse and wrapped a blanket more securely around him. "You should eat too, Mum," he said, handing her a wooden bowl filled with the steaming stew. "You're no good to the boy if you're sick yourself." She took the bowl, her hands trembling. The warmth of it was a shock to her cold fingers. She took a spoonful and the flavor was a revelation. It tasted of survival, of a deep knowledge of the land, of something wild and authentic. For the first time in months she felt the gnawing emptiness in her stomach begin to recede. As she ate, she watched him. He had his back to her, looking out the window at the swirling storm. His rifle was propped against the wall, but he seemed to have forgotten about it. His focus was entirely on the cabin, on the warmth of the fire, on the small boy sleeping peacefully on the floor. "Why are you helping us?" she asked, her voice small. He turned, his green eyes meeting hers. "I don't know, ma'am. I had to. I saw the cabin, and something inside me said I had to come here." He paused, and she saw a flicker of that pain again, a deep well of sadness. "I've been on my own for a long time. It's lonely, and I've seen things no man should have to see, people left to die, people who are just abandoned." His voice trailed off and he looked away, his gaze falling on the small framed photograph of Thomas on the mantelpiece. He didn't ask who the man was, but she could see the unspoken question in his eyes. "That was my husband, Thomas," she said, her voice catching. He died a few months ago. A hunting accident." Jed nodded slowly. "I'm sorry, ma'am, he looks like a good man." "He was," she said, a tear finally escaping and rolling down her cheek. "He was my whole world. He was the reason I came out here, for a new life, a new beginning." Jed didn't say anything. He just looked at her, his expression a mix of sympathy and a deep, shared sorrow. He seemed to understand not just the words she was saying, but the grief beneath them. He was a man who had seen his own share of loss, of loneliness. After they had eaten, Jed settled down by the fire, his massive frame dwarfing the small space. Ilara sat on a stool across from him, Liam sleeping peacefully between them. The fire crackled, a comforting sound that filled the silence. "You're not from around here," she finally said. It wasn't a question. "No," he said. "I've been traveling for years. I don't really have a home. The mountains, they're my home. I live off the land. I find things. I sell them to trappers and traders." "And you just happened to be passing by in the middle of a blizzard?" she asked, a hint of suspicion in her voice. He looked at her, a wry smile on his face. "I'm not a man of convenience, Mum, but I am a man of instinct, and my instincts told me to come here. They have a funny way of being right." The conversation died, and the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the low moan of the wind outside. Ilara found herself studying him, this strange man who had appeared out of the storm to save them. He had a strong, square jaw, a nose that had been broken more than once, and a scar that ran from his left eyebrow down to his cheek. He was a man who had seen and lived through much. She felt a strange mix of fear and comfort in his presence. He was a dangerous man, she knew that much, but he was also their only hope. She closed her eyes, the warmth of the fire lulling her into a peaceful state. The last thing she remembered was the soft rhythmic sound of Jed's breathing and the gentle, protective way he watched over her and her son. The mountain man, the one who had warned her he was too big for her world, had become their quiet guardian, and the fragile hope he had brought with him was more precious than gold. The storm passed, leaving behind a world blanketed in a pristine, blinding white. The sun, a cold and distant orb, cast long blue shadows across the snow. Elara woke to the sound of Jed chopping wood outside. The rhythmic thud of the axe was a reassuring sound, a symbol of life and survival in a world that had tried to claim them. She found him by the woodpile, his massive frame moving with a surprising economy of motion. He had already cleared a path to the outhouse and was now splitting a large log with ease. Steam rose from his breath in the frigid air. "You shouldn't be out here alone, ma'am," he said, not looking up from his work. "The snow's deep, and you're not used to it." "I can't just sit inside," she replied, her voice filled with a newfound energy. The warmth of the fire and the food from the previous night had revitalized her. "I have to do something." "Then get a bucket and fill it with snow. We can melt it for water, but stay close to the cabin." She did as he instructed, marveling at the sheer scale of the man. He was a force of nature, a one-man army against the elements. She had lived a sheltered life, a life of comfort and predictable routines. Jed was a living embodiment of the raw, untamed world she had found herself in. After they had finished their chores, they went inside. Liam was awake and seemed to be feeling better, his small body no longer trembling. He looked at Jed with wide, curious eyes. "Are you a giant?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. A small smile, a rare glimpse of something genuine and warm, touched Jed's lips. "Something like that, little man. I'm just a big fella, that's all." "My daddy was big," Liam said, a hint of sadness in his voice. "He was strong, too." Jed's smile vanished, replaced by that familiar, distant look. "I'm sure he was, son. But now you have me to help you and your mama." The words were simple, but they carried a weight of promise that Elara found herself believing. For the first time since Thomas's death, she didn't feel so alone. Later that afternoon, as Jed was teaching Elara how to properly load and aim a rifle, a new sound cut through the silence. It was the crunch of hooves in the snow, a sound of foreboding. Elara's heart sank. She knew who it was. Silas Thorne, astride a powerful black horse, rode up to the cabin, a sneer on his face. He was flanked by two of his hired hands, brutish men with cruel eyes. "Well, well, Elara," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "I heard you were in a bad way. I see you found yourself a little hired hand." His eyes lingered on Jed, a flicker of surprise and annoyance in them. He clearly hadn't expected to find a man of Jed's stature here. Jed didn't say a word. He just stood there, his massive frame a protective shield between Silas and the cabin. He held the rifle loosely in his hand, a silent but powerful threat. Silas's gaze hardened. "Who are you, stranger? This is a private matter between me and the lady." "The lady is under my protection now," Jed said, his voice low and steady, "and her business is my business." A tense silence hung in the air, broken only by the snorting of the horses. Silas's eyes narrowed, a challenge in their depths. He was used to being the biggest man in the room, but Jed was a different kind of big. He was raw, untamed, and radiated a dangerous calm that was more intimidating than any show of aggression. "You're a fool, stranger," Silas said, finally breaking the silence. "You don't know who you're dealing with. I own this valley, and I'm going to own this land, one way or another." Jed just looked at him, his green eyes unblinking. "You can try," he said, his voice holding an unmistakable note of finality. "But you're a long way from home, and this is my land now, and I don't take kindly to trespassers." A muscle in Silas's jaw twitched. The threat was clear, and it was backed by the sheer physical presence of the man. He knew better than to push it. Not now, not with a storm coming. "This isn't over, Elara," Silas spat, his gaze full of venom. "You and your boy are on your own, and he won't be there forever. And when he's gone, I'll be waiting." He turned his horse and rode away, his two men following close behind. Elara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked at Jed, who was still standing there, a mountain of a man in the endless snow. He had saved them again, not with a gun, but with his presence alone. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with a gratitude so profound it hurt. He just nodded, his gaze still fixed on the disappearing figures. "He'll be back," he said, his voice flat. "He's a snake, and snakes don't give up. We have to be ready." The tension remained, a palpable thing in the cold air. The conflict was no longer a silent internal struggle for survival. It was now a real and present threat, a shadow that had a name: Silas Thorne. And the two of them, a widow and a mountain man, were all that stood against him. With Silas's departure, a fragile new routine settled over the cabin. Jed, despite his initial reluctance, became an integral part of their lives. He was a man of the land, and he began to teach Ilara the things she would need to survive. He taught her how to set traps for small game, how to identify edible plants, and how to track animals in the snow. His knowledge was vast and intuitive, a lifetime of living off the land ingrained in his every movement. Ilara, a woman who had once thought of a trip to the general store as a major excursion, found herself learning to read the subtle signs of the wilderness. "The wind whispers the truth," he'd say, his voice low. "Listen to it. It'll tell you where the game is. It'll tell you when a storm is coming, and it'll tell you when danger is near." He also taught her how to shoot. He was a patient and meticulous teacher, his powerful hands guiding hers as she held the heavy rifle. "Don't fight the gun," he'd say. "Become one with it. It's a tool, not a weapon of fear. It's your protector." She was a quick study, and her hands, which had trembled with fear a few weeks ago, now held the rifle with a newfound steadiness. Her aim improved with each passing day, and she felt a growing sense of competence, a feeling that had been lost since Thomas's death. Jed was an enigma. He would spend hours with Liam, teaching him to whittle small figures out of wood and telling him stories of the mountains. He was surprisingly gentle with the boy, a side of him that contrasted sharply with the dangerous aura he carried. Liam, in turn, adored him, seeing him as a hero from one of his storybooks. He had a way of bringing out the best in Jed, of making the giant of a man feel small and vulnerable. One afternoon, as Ilara was preparing a meal, she heard Jed and Liam talking outside. "What's that scar on your face, Jed?" Liam asked, his voice filled with a child's innocent curiosity. There was a long silence, and Ilara held her breath. She knew the scar was a sensitive subject. She had often wondered about it, a silent question in her mind. "It's from a bear," Jed finally said, his voice low. "I was a young man, thought I was invincible, found a bear's den, didn't know she had cubs. She got me good." "Did you kill her?" Liam asked. "No," Jed said, and his voice held a profound sadness. "I couldn't. She was just protecting her family, just like I'm protecting you and your mama." Ilara's heart ached for him. His words were so simple, but they contained a world of pain and regret. She realized that his impulsiveness, the "I can't control myself" he had warned her about, wasn't just about violence. It was about a deep internal conflict, a struggle between the wild man he was and the gentle man he wanted to be. Their days were a rhythm of chores, lessons, and quiet companionship. The cabin, once a place of sorrow and loneliness, had become a home again, a place of warmth and survival. Jed, the stranger from the storm, had brought a kind of hope with him, a fierce, untamed kind of hope. But the peace was fragile. Every day, Ilara would look out at the horizon, a knot of anxiety in her stomach. She knew Silas was out there, watching, waiting for his chance. She knew he wouldn't give up. He was a predator, and he would stalk his prey until he got what he wanted. And Jed, for all his strength, was a wild card. His moods were unpredictable. Sometimes a dark shadow would fall over his face, and he would retreat into himself, his green eyes filled with a distant pain. She didn't know the full story of his past, but she knew it was a heavy burden, a burden that could come back to haunt them all. But for now they were safe. The fire was warm, the food was plentiful, and the cabin was filled with a quiet, fragile peace. Ilara knew it was temporary, that the storm of Silas was still brewing on the horizon. But for now she was grateful for the lessons Jed was teaching her, and for the way he had transformed her despair into a new kind of strength. The next 2 weeks were a strange idyll. The sun shone, the snow began to settle, and life took on a quiet rhythm. Jed became a fixture in their lives, a silent protector. He would go out hunting every morning, returning with rabbits or deer, always ensuring they had enough food. He seemed to know the woods like the back of his hand, navigating the trails with an ease that Ilara could only marvel at. One day, while Jed was out, Ilara decided to try and hunt on her own. She knew she had to learn to be self-sufficient. Jed wouldn't be here forever. She took the rifle, a bit of dried jerky, and a canteen and ventured out. She didn't go far, just a small distance into the woods near the cabin. She walked slowly, her eyes scanning the ground for tracks, her ears listening for the subtle sounds of the forest. The quiet was profound, broken only by the crunch of her boots in the snow. She found a set of rabbit tracks and began to follow them, her heart thumping with a mixture of fear and excitement. She had to prove to herself that she could do this. She had to be strong for Liam. She followed the tracks for what felt like miles, her breath coming in ragged puffs. They led her to a small clearing where she saw it. A small grey rabbit was nibbling on some dried leaves near a bush. It was the perfect shot. Her hands were steady as she raised the rifle, her eyes squinting down the barrel. She held her breath, her finger on the trigger. Just as she was about to shoot, she heard a sound, a faint rustle in the bushes behind her. Her heart leapt into her throat. She lowered the rifle, her body tensing. She slowly turned, her eyes scanning the dense underbrush. Nothing, just the trees covered in a blanket of snow. A feeling of unease washed over her. It was a primal, instinctive fear, the feeling of being watched. She slowly raised the rifle again, her focus on the rabbit, but her mind was now on the woods behind her. She knew she had to get this over with. She took a deep breath, her finger tightening on the trigger. A sound, this time clearer, made her jump. It was a footstep, a heavy, deliberate one. She whirled around, the rifle shaking in her hands. A figure stood there, partially hidden by the trees. It was a man, and for a terrifying moment she thought it was Silas, but as he stepped into the light, she realized it wasn't. It was another man, younger than Silas, but with the same cruel sneer on his face. It was one of Silas's hired hands, the one with the long, jagged scar on his cheek. "Well, well," he said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "Looks like we found little Miss Vance all alone." Ilara's mind raced. She was too far from the cabin to run. She was alone, with no one to help her. She clutched the rifle tightly, her knuckles white. "You should have stayed inside," he said, taking a step closer. "The boss says he's tired of waiting." She raised the rifle, aiming it directly at his chest. "Get back," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I'll shoot." He laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You're a woman, ma'am. You ain't gonna shoot nobody." He took another step and then another. Her finger tightened on the trigger, but her mind was screaming. She had never shot a man before. Could she do it? Could she take a life, even to save her own? Just as he was about to lunge, a new voice, a roar of pure, unadulterated rage, filled the air. "Get away from her!" Jed emerged from the woods, a blur of motion. He was an unstoppable force of nature, his movements powerful and swift. The man with the scar didn't even have time to react. Jed slammed into him, a guttural yell escaping his lips. The man went down hard, his rifle clattering to the ground. Jed was a terrifying sight. His face was a mask of fury, his eyes a dangerous, burning green. He had the man pinned to the ground, his powerful hand wrapped around his throat. He looked like a wild animal, a predator defending its territory. Ilara just stood there, her body frozen, the rifle still in her hands. The sudden violence of the scene was a shock to her system. This was the Jed she had been warned about, the one who couldn't control himself. "You tell Silas Thorne," Jed snarled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You tell him if he ever comes near this land again, I will hunt him down. I will find him and I will tear him apart, you hear me?" The man on the ground was gasping for air, his face turning a sickly shade of purple. Jed's rage was a palpable thing, a hot, suffocating presence in the cold air. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the fury vanished. Jed's eyes cleared, and a look of horror, a deep, profound self-loathing crossed his face. He released the man's throat, stumbling back a few steps as if he had been burned. "Get out of here," he said, his voice now a hollow whisper. "And don't you ever come back." The man scrambled to his feet, grabbed his rifle and ran. He didn't even look back. He just disappeared into the trees. Ilara lowered her rifle, her body shaking uncontrollably. Jed stood there, a ghost of his former rage still clinging to him. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, silent shame. "I'm sorry," he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. "I told you, I can't control myself." A single tear, a familiar sign of his vulnerability, traced a path down his cheek. Ilara looked at him, at the raw pain in his eyes. She saw not a monster, but a man haunted by his own power. And in that moment she wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid for him. The incident in the woods left a profound silence between Ilara and Jed. He had returned to his quiet, stoic self, but something had changed. The fragile peace had been shattered, and the shadow of his warning hung heavy in the air. He avoided her gaze, and she could see the shame and regret etched on his face. She tried to talk to him about it that evening as they sat by the fire after Liam had gone to sleep. "Jed," she said softly, You saved my life today. I was terrified. He would have hurt me." He didn't look at her. He just stared into the flames, his green eyes reflecting the dancing light. "That's not who I am," he said, his voice low and full of pain. That was the other man." "What other man?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. He finally turned to her, his gaze intense and weary. "The man who can't control himself, the one who has seen too much blood, the one who is too big for your world." She reached out and placed a hand on his arm. His muscles were tense, like coiled springs. "That's not what I saw," she said. "I saw a man who protected me, a man who was a force for good. You were a guardian, Jed, a protector." A dry, bitter laugh escaped his lips. "You don't know my past, Ilara. You don't know the things I've done, the men I've broken. I'm not a hero, ma'am. I'm a man with a darkness inside me, and it's only a matter of time before it comes out." He looked away, and a deep, heavy sigh escaped his lips. "I told you. I'm a walking curse. I should have never come here. You and your boy would be better off without me." Her heart ached for him. She saw the torment in his eyes, the deep-seated guilt that haunted him. She knew he was a good man at his core, but he was a man who had been pushed to his limits, a man who had seen the worst of humanity and had to become something dark to survive it. "Jed," she said, her voice firm, "we need you. I need you. Liam needs you. You are our only hope against a man like Silas. And a man who has that much goodness inside him, enough to care for a stranger and her son, can't be all bad." He looked at her then, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Her words had reached him, a small beacon of light in his self-imposed darkness. He didn't say anything, but the tension in his body seemed to ease a little. The next morning, he was back to his usual routine, but with a new quietness. He went out hunting, returning with a large deer slung over his shoulder. The meat would last them for weeks. As he was butchering it, Ilara came out to help. "I need to learn how to do this," she said. "I can't be a burden." Jed looked at her, a hint of a smile in his eyes. "You're not a burden, Mum. You're a partner, and you're a quick study." He began to show her how to properly gut the deer, how to skin it, how to cut the meat into manageable pieces. He was a patient teacher, and as they worked together, the silence between them was no longer awkward or filled with tension. It was a comfortable, shared space. She learned that his knowledge of the wilderness was not just a tool for survival, it was a form of art. He knew the land, the animals, the seasons, with a kind of intimacy that was both beautiful and a little frightening. He was a part of the wilderness, as much as the bears and the wolves he spoke of. Later that day, as the sun began to set, she saw him sitting by a small stream, his head in his hands. She walked up to him quietly. "What's wrong?" she asked softly. He looked up, and his green eyes were filled with a profound weariness. "This is a beautiful land," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The mountains. They have a way of getting into your soul, but they're also a place where a man can get lost. And once you're lost, it's hard to find your way back." "Did you get lost, Jed?" she asked. He looked at her, a sad, knowing look on his face. "A long time ago, Ilara. A long time ago." He didn't elaborate, but she knew the answer was yes. He had been lost, and he was still trying to find his way back. She realized then that she was not just a widow in need of protection. She was a woman who was offering a chance at redemption to a man who desperately needed it. And in their shared struggle for survival, a strange and powerful bond was forming, one built on a foundation of vulnerability, trust, and a shared understanding of loss. The next few days brought a sense of normalcy, a welcome calm before the inevitable storm. The rhythm of their lives was established, and the cabin was a fortress of quiet defiance against the outside world. But the calm was short-lived. A sound, different from the crunch of Silas's men, reached Ilara's ears. It was the rhythmic clop-clop of a single horse, a sound that spoke of purpose and authority. She looked out the window and saw a man on a horse, a badge gleaming on his chest. It was the sheriff, a man named Marcus Grant. He was a good man, fair and just, but he was also pragmatic. He was a man who believed in the law and in the power of reason. Jed was outside, fixing a broken latch on the gate. He didn't seem to notice the approaching rider. Ilara ran outside, her heart thumping in her chest. "Jed, it's the sheriff," she said, her voice filled with a nervous energy. "Silas must have sent him." Jed looked up, his face impassive. "He's just doing his job, ma'am. Let him come." The sheriff dismounted, his face a grim mask. He was a tall man, but he was dwarfed by Jed's immense frame. He gave Jed a long, appraising look, then turned his attention to Ilara. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice calm and professional. "Silas Thorne filed a complaint. He says a drifter came onto his land and assaulted one of his men. He says this man threatened his life." Ilara's mind raced. Silas was a clever man. He had twisted the story to make it sound like Jed was the aggressor, a violent stranger causing trouble. "That's not true, Sheriff," she said, her voice firm. "His man came onto my property. He was threatening me. Jed was just defending me." Sheriff Grant's gaze shifted to Jed. "Is that what happened, son?" Jed looked at him, his green eyes calm and steady. "His man trespassed on her land, Sheriff. He had a rifle, and he was threatening her. I was just protecting what's mine." The words hung in the air, a small but profound claim. Jed was no longer just a drifter. He had claimed this place, this woman, and her son as his own. Sheriff Grant was a perceptive man. He could see the truth in Jed's eyes, the quiet strength and resolve. He knew Silas Thorne. He knew the man's ambition and his ruthless nature. "I can't just take your word for it, ma'am," the sheriff said, his voice apologetic. "I have to investigate. The man has a deep cut on his throat. He says this man nearly killed him." Jed's jaw tightened. "I did what I had to do," he said, his voice flat. "He's lucky I didn't finish the job." Ilara's heart sank. Jed's lack of diplomacy was not helping their case. "Jed, no," she said, placing a hand on his arm. "He was just defending me, Sheriff. He was scared. He has a past he's trying to get away from, but he's a good man." The sheriff looked at Jed again, a flicker of something she couldn't name in his eyes. He saw the same thing she did, a man tormented by his own nature, but one who was fundamentally decent. "Listen to me, Jedediah Stone," Sheriff Grant said, his voice low and serious. "I'm not saying I don't believe you, but Silas Thorne has a lot of influence in this town. He's got the judge in his pocket. He's got a lot of men. If you get in trouble with him, he'll make sure you pay for it. The law can only do so much to protect a man like you." The sheriff's warning was clear. The law was on Silas's side, not on theirs. It was a rigged game. Jed's strength and his ability to live outside the rules were both his greatest asset and his biggest liability. "I understand, Sheriff," Jed said, his voice quiet. "I don't need the law to protect me. I can protect myself, and I can protect this family." Sheriff Grant sighed, a deep, weary sound. "I hope so, son. Because you're going to need more than just your wits to survive this. Silas Thorne is not a man to be trifled with." He looked at Ilara, his expression one of sympathy. "I'll do what I can, ma'am, but you're on your own out here. Be careful." He turned his horse and rode off, leaving them in the silent, cold air. The visit had a chilling effect. It wasn't just a simple threat anymore, it was a legal and social battle. Jed was an outlaw in the eyes of the law, and Silas was the powerful, respected landowner. The deck was stacked against them. Elara looked at Jed, who was still staring after the disappearing figure of the sheriff. He was a wanted man now, a target, and all because he had protected her. She felt a wave of guilt and a fierce surge of loyalty. She would not let him face this alone. He had chosen to stand with her, and she would stand with him. The sheriff's visit was the final nail in the coffin of their quiet existence. It was no longer a matter of survival against the elements. It was a war. Silas Thorne was not a man to be trifled with, and now that Jed was a legal liability, he would use it to his advantage. Jed seemed to understand the gravity of the situation more than anyone. He spent the next few days preparing, not just for the elements but for a siege. He brought in more firewood, sealed the gaps in the cabin with mud and straw, and fortified the windows with thick planks of wood. He was a man of action, a man who believed in preparation, not in a passive acceptance of his fate. He also spent more time with Elara, teaching her not just how to hunt and shoot, but how to fight. He was a brutal but effective teacher. He taught her how to use a knife, how to defend herself with her hands, and how to use the environment to her advantage. "A woman's strength isn't in her muscles, Elara," he'd say, as he held her hands in a firm grip. "It's in her mind. You have to be smart. You have to be able to anticipate their moves. You have to be a ghost." She was a fast learner. The fear that had once paralyzed her was now a fuel, a source of fierce determination. She would not be a victim, she would be a survivor. But the most profound change was in their relationship. The lines between rescuer and rescued, between stranger and friend, blurred. They were now a team, an unlikely and dangerous alliance. They were two people against a world that wanted to break them. One night, as a fresh coat of snow fell, they were sitting by the fire, a companionable silence between them. Liam was fast asleep in his bed. "Why me, Jed?" she asked, breaking the silence. "Why did you choose to stay? You could have left. You could have gone anywhere." He looked at her, his green eyes filled with a look she couldn't quite decipher. "I told you, Elara, my instincts. They told me to stay. They told me you were in trouble." He paused, and a rare, genuine smile touched his lips. "But it wasn't just that, it was, I don't know, something about this place, something about you. You're strong, stronger than you know, and you're not a quitter. I've been running from myself for a long time. I've been running from the man I am. But with you and Liam, I'm a different man. I'm the man I want to be." Her heart ached for him. His words were so simple, so raw, but they held so much weight. She saw the man he was, and the man he wanted to be, and she knew she had a part in that. "Thank you, Jed," she said, her voice a soft whisper, "for everything." He didn't say anything, but he reached out and took her hand. His hand was rough and calloused, a map of his hard life, but his touch was gentle and reassuring. They sat there for a long time, their hands clasped together, two people from different worlds, two souls who had found each other in the vast, unforgiving landscape of the West. The next morning, the sun rose, casting a golden light on the snow-covered land. But the beauty was a lie. The peace was a temporary facade. Elara knew it. Jed knew it. They were in a race against time, a battle for survival. And the final chapter of their story, the one that would determine their fate, was just beginning. The storm was coming, and its name was Silas Thorne. And this time, it would be a storm of a different kind, one of men, not of nature. And she and Jed would be ready. The bitter cold of winter had settled over the land, a heavy blanket that muffled sound and slowed the passage of time. Inside the cabin, a different kind of calm had taken hold. Jed, a man who had once been a stranger, was now the solid foundation of their world. He was a creature of routine and a master of preparation. Each day had a purpose: chopping wood, mending fences, and ensuring their food and water supplies were well stocked. Elara found herself mirroring his habits. She learned to mend clothing, to stretch every meal, and to find a kind of strength she never knew she possessed. Her hands, once soft and unused to labor, were now calloused and capable. The fear that had once been her constant companion had given way to a fierce determination. She wasn't just surviving. She was building a life, a new life, from the ashes of the old. The relationship between Jed and Liam had blossomed into something beautiful and unspoken. Jed taught the boy to carve little animals out of wood, his massive hands working with surprising precision. Liam, in turn, brought a light to Jed's eyes that Ilara had not seen before. He told Jed stories he had learned from his father, tales of heroes and adventures that made the mountain man's grim face soften with a rare smile. One evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Liam sat on a stool between them, drawing in a notebook with a piece of charcoal. "What are you drawing, son?" Jed asked, his voice low and warm. "It's you, Jed," Liam said, holding up the crude drawing. "You're a giant, and you're fighting a bad man." Jed's smile faded, replaced by that familiar, distant sadness. He looked at Ilara, a silent question in his eyes. "The past is just a story, Jed," Ilara said, understanding his unspoken fear. "It's the future that matters." He didn't reply, but his gaze remained on her, a silent gratitude in his eyes. She knew he was battling his own demons, the ghosts of his past that came with the territory of being the man he was. He was a protector, but he was also a man who was deeply ashamed of the person he had been. Days turned into weeks, and the stillness of the season was only broken by the occasional sound of Jed's axe or the crunch of their footsteps in the snow. They were a small, self-contained world, a fragile bubble of safety in a hostile land. But the quiet was deceptive. It was the calm before the storm, and they both knew it. Jed had taken to standing watch at night, his silhouette a formidable presence at the window. He was a hunter, and he could feel the presence of the predator. Silas Thorne was out there, watching, waiting for his moment to strike. He was a patient man, a cruel man, and he would not be denied. One morning, Jed returned from a hunt with a worried look on his face. He had been gone longer than usual, and Ilara had grown anxious. "What is it, Jed?" she asked as he came in, shaking the snow from his furs. "Silas's men," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I found their tracks. They've been circling the cabin. They're getting closer." A knot of fear tightened in her stomach. They had been living in a false sense of security, and the illusion was shattered. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jed's gaze was steady, his eyes filled with a steely resolve. "We wait. We don't make a move until they do. We're on our land. We're in our home. We have the advantage." He was right. The cabin was a fortress and he had made it impregnable. But she knew that physical defenses were not enough. Silas was a man who fought with lies and manipulation, and he would use every trick in the book to get what he wanted. He was not a man to be underestimated, and his patience was a weapon. That night, as the wind howled outside, Ilara couldn't sleep. She watched Jed from the bed, his back to her, a solid, unmoving presence. He was their shield, their guardian. She knew he was a man of violence, but she also knew he was a man of honor. He had made a promise to protect them, and he would not break it. She closed her eyes, a silent prayer on her lips. They were a small, fragile family, a widow, a child, and a mountain man standing against the world. She knew their time was limited, and the battle was coming. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. She was ready. The day was cold and grey, the sky a bruised canvas of white and purple. The wind was relentless, carrying with it a new kind of chill, the chill of fear. Ilara was inside, teaching Liam how to whittle a small horse, when a sound made her heart stop. It wasn't a sound she had heard before. It was the rhythmic thud of a horse's hooves, but this time it was accompanied by the jingle of a bell. Jed, who had been chopping wood outside, came in, his face grim. "He sent a messenger," he said, his voice low. Ilara peered through a crack in the window. A young man, no older than 20, sat on a horse in the middle of their driveway. He was well dressed, his clothes a stark contrast to the rugged look of Silas's other men. He held a large, ornate envelope in his hand. Jed stepped out of the cabin, his presence a dark, imposing shadow against the snow. The young man's eyes widened, and he seemed to shrink in his saddle. "Are you the man they call Jedediah Stone?" the young man asked, his voice trembling slightly. "I am," Jed replied, his voice a low rumble. "I have a message from Silas Thorne," the young man said, holding out the envelope. "He says this is your last chance." Jed took the envelope, his fingers carefully breaking the seal. He pulled out the letter, his eyes scanning the words. A muscle in his jaw twitched. "What does it say?" Ilara asked from the doorway, her voice a tense whisper. Jed crumpled the letter in his hand, his eyes burning with a dangerous fire. "He says he's giving us until the spring thaw," he said, his voice filled with a quiet fury. "He says if we're not gone by then, he'll take the land by force, and he says he's a generous man. He's offering to give me a chance to get out alive. But he says I have to leave you and the boy behind." A wave of fear and revulsion washed over Ilara. Silas was a coward. He knew he couldn't take on Jed head-on, so he was trying to break their will, to drive a wedge between them. "You can tell Silas Thorne," Jed said, his voice a low, dangerous growl, "that this land is our home, and we're not going anywhere. Tell him to come and get it." The young man's face was pale. He had seen the look in Jed's eyes, and he knew that Jed was a man of his word. He quickly turned his horse and galloped away, the jingle of the bell growing fainter in the distance. Ilara walked out and stood beside Jed, her hand resting on his arm. "He's trying to get you to leave," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "He knows he can't win against you." Jed's gaze was fixed on the horizon, his expression unreadable. "He's not a fool. He knows I'm a man who can't be bought or intimidated. He thinks he can turn us against each other. He's trying to get inside my head. He's trying to make me believe that I'm a burden, that I'm putting you and Liam in danger." "You're not a burden," she said, her voice firm. "You're our protector. We're in this together." He looked at her then, his green eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and a deep, abiding sadness. "I'm a man who's used to fighting alone, Ilara. I don't know how to fight for someone else. I don't know how to lose." His words hung in the air, a confession of his deepest fear. He was a man who had survived by being alone, and now for the first time he had something to lose. That night Jed spent hours sharpening his hunting knives and cleaning his rifle. He was preparing for the inevitable. The spring thaw was a ticking clock, and every passing day was a step closer to the final showdown. Ilara sat by the fire, a book in her hands, but her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. She was no longer just a spectator in her own life. She was a participant, a warrior in a war she had never asked for. She was fighting for her home, for her son, and for the man who had appeared out of the storm to save them. The messenger's visit had changed everything. It had brought the conflict to a head. The quiet, unspoken war was now out in the open, and there would be no going back. The final confrontation was coming, and they would be ready. They had to be. The winter deepened, and so did the quiet tension in the cabin. The letter from Silas was a constant, unspoken presence, a shadow hanging over their heads. Jed's demeanor had changed. He was more watchful, more on edge. He trained Ilara with a new intensity, pushing her to her limits, teaching her every trick he knew to survive. He showed her how to use a rope as a weapon, how to set traps for men, not just animals, and how to use the terrain to their advantage. He was a master of his craft, a man who had lived his life on the edge, and he was now sharing that knowledge with her, a silent, desperate transfer of power. "You have to be a ghost, Ilara," he would say, his voice low. "You have to be able to move without a sound. You have to be able to disappear. The enemy can't shoot what they can't see." She absorbed his lessons like a sponge, her mind sharp and focused. Her body, once soft and unused to physical exertion, was now toned and strong. She was no longer a victim. She was a fighter. One afternoon, as the snow fell in fat, lazy flakes, Jed sat on the porch, staring out at the white world. Ilara walked out and stood beside him, her hands tucked into her sleeves. "I need to ask you something, Jed," she said, her voice soft. He didn't look at her. "What is it, ma'am?" "The scar," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You said it was from a bear, but I feel like there's more to it." He was silent for a long time, the only sound the gentle falling of the snow. He finally looked at her, his green eyes filled with a pain so profound it took her breath away. "It wasn't a bear," he said, his voice a low, heavy rumble. It was a man I used to know. He took a deep breath, and the story came tumbling out, a confession he had been holding in for years. He had been a trapper, a young man with a temper and a reputation for being a force of nature. He had a partner, a man he considered a friend. They had a falling out over a lucrative find, and the argument turned violent. "I lost control," Jed said, his voice filled with a deep self-loathing. "I used my strength. I nearly killed him. I left him for dead, and I took the furs and the money. I ran." He paused, and a single tear traced a path down his weathered cheek. "I thought I could outrun my past. I thought I could outrun the man I was. But I couldn't. He found me. He came at me with a knife. He got me good. He touched the scar on his face, his fingers tracing the jagged line. He didn't kill me. He just marked me, a reminder of the monster I am. He said I was too big for his world, but I couldn't control myself. He was right. He was right about everything." Ilara's heart ached for him. She saw the torment in his eyes, the deep, abiding shame that had been his constant companion for years. She knew he was a man who had made a terrible mistake, but she also knew he was a man who had been paying for it ever since. "You're not that man anymore, Jed," she said, her voice soft but firm. "The man who nearly killed his friend. That man is gone. He was lost in the mountains. The man who came to my door in the storm, the man who saved my son. That's the man I know. That's the man I'll stand with." He looked at her, a flicker of hope in his eyes, a small fragile light in the darkness of his past. He reached out and took her hand, his grasp strong and reassuring. "Thank you, Ilara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I haven't heard that in a long time. I haven't heard that I'm a good man." A silence settled between them, a comfortable shared space. They were no longer just two people living in the same house. They were two souls who had found a common ground in their shared pain. He was a man who had lost his way, and she was a woman who had lost her world. And together they were forging a new path, a new future. They made a silent pact that day, a promise that went beyond words. They would face the future together. They would fight for their home, for Liam and for each other. They would stand against the world, and they would not be broken. The story of their pasts was over. The story of their future was just beginning. The spring thaw arrived not with a gentle hum, a gradual softening of the land, but with a sudden violent roar that shook the very foundations of the valley. It was a visceral transformation. The once pristine, almost sacred blanket of white snow, which had for months cradled the earth in silent slumber, now turned into a treacherous, churning landscape of mud, slush, and overflowing, swollen streams. The deep, heavy drifts, once solid and unyielding, collapsed with a groan, releasing torrents of icy water that carved new paths through the thawing earth. The silence that had reigned supreme through the long winter nights was abruptly shattered by the low, constant murmur of running water, a cacophony of drips, trickles, and gushes that spoke of immense, untamed power. The land, once frozen in suspended animation, was now alive, groaning and shifting, a restless giant awakening from its sleep. Every sound carried further in the damp, heavy air, every creak of timber in the cabin, every distant snap of a branch, sharpening their senses to an almost unbearable degree. This furious thaw was more than just a seasonal change. It was a ticking clock. It was Silas Thorne's grim signal, an unspoken agreement that the winter's natural barricade was broken, and it was time for the final bloody confrontation. Jed was palpably more on edge than ever, his senses heightened to an almost animalistic degree, his vigilance a constant burning flame. He spent his days patrolling the perimeter of the property, his massive frame moving through the treacherous, uneven terrain with a deceptive agility. His rifle, a well-oiled extension of his arm, was his constant companion, held with a familiarity that spoke of a lifetime spent relying on its cold steel. He wasn't just walking. He was observing, a hunter meticulously surveying his territory. He noted every subtle change in the mud, every disturbed clump of slush, searching for the faintest sign of an intrusion, a broken twig, a scuff mark that wasn't their own. The air itself seemed to crackle with anticipation, and Jed, a creature of instinct and the wilderness, felt it in his bones. He knew the psychology of a predator, And Silas, for all his bluster, was a cunning one, waiting for the opportune moment. Ilara, once a sheltered city woman, was now an integral part of these patrols. Her transformation had been profound. She had learned to read the subtle signs of the land, Jed's patient tutelage etching itself into her very being. She could now spot a broken twig with a hunter's keen eye, differentiate between animal tracks and a fresh set of boot prints left by a human intruder. She was no longer just following Jed. She was anticipating his movements, her gaze sweeping the tree lines, the gullies, and the winding paths with a focused intensity. She was a silent partner, a keen observer, and, in her steadfast presence, an unwavering source of strength for Jed. Her hands, though still retaining a softness beneath the calluses, held her own rifle with a new authoritative grip. She moved with a calculated grace through the treacherous mud, her fear having transmuted into a fierce, unwavering resolve. She understood that this fight was not just for land, it was for their very right to exist in peace. One afternoon, as they were completing their silent, tense circuit of the perimeter, they came across a small, unsettling sight that sent a chill down Ilara's spine, colder than any lingering winter breeze. It was a crude wooden figure, barely recognizable as a doll, made of gnarled twigs and coarse twine, hanging precariously from a low-hanging branch. Its form was grotesque and unsettling, a distorted mockery of human shape, swaying gently in the damp breeze. It was a clear, malicious message from Silas Thorne, a psychological arrow aimed directly at their fragile sense of security. Jed's jaw tightened visibly, a muscle bunching under his ear, and a dangerous glint entered his green eyes. He quickly took the figure down, his fingers surprisingly gentle as he detached it, only to throw it to the ground with a raw force that spoke volumes. He then stomped on it with his heavy boot, crushing the crude effigy into the mud, a symbolic act of defiance. "He's playing games," Jed said, his voice a low, dangerous growl, the sound rumbling deep in his chest. "He's trying to scare us. He's trying to get inside our heads, to make us doubt ourselves, to break our will before he even shows his face." The psychological warfare was clear, and Jed recognized the insidious nature of it. He knew Silas wasn't just a brute, he was a manipulator. "It's not working," Ilara said, her voice firm, cutting through the tension with a conviction that surprised even herself. "We're not scared, Jed. We're ready. He can send his twisted messages, but they only strengthen our resolve." He looked at her then, a flicker of admiration in his eyes, a silent acknowledgement of her incredible growth. She was no longer the frightened widow who had trembled at his initial, imposing presence. She was a woman who had found her power, her unwavering resolve, a steel hidden beneath a gentle exterior. She was his equal in this desperate stand. As they walked back to the cabin, the sun began its descent, casting long, dark shadows across the muddy, undulating land. The sky was a fiery orange, bleeding into bruised purples and greys, a dramatic canvas reflecting the impending conflict. The air was still and humid, heavy with the smell of wet earth and melting snow, an unsettling stillness that preceded a storm. The Thor was a beast, an untamed force that held them in its jaws, poised for the final, violent squeeze. That night, as Ilara was putting Liam to bed, singing him a soft, almost inaudible lullaby, she felt a profound, aching sense of gratitude. She had a home, a son, and a man who would fight for them to the death, a man who had chosen to be their protector. She had lost so much, more than she ever thought she could bear, but in the crucible of hardship she had also gained immeasurably. She had found a new kind of family, a new kind of love, in the most unlikely of places, forged from desperation and mutual respect. She walked out to the porch where Jed was sitting, his rifle resting on his lap, a silent sentinel in the gathering darkness. He was an imposing figure, a mountain of a man, his silhouette stark against the fading light. "Jed," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper in the vast quiet. "He'll come at dawn," he said, his voice a low, certain rumble, devoid of any doubt. "He's a coward. He'll want to strike when we're least expecting it, when the light is just beginning to break, when our guard might be lowest, but we'll be ready, we'll be waiting." She sat down beside him, the silence between them a comfortable, shared space, a testament to their profound understanding. She didn't ask how he knew, she just knew he did. He was a man of instincts, a man who could feel the pulse of the land and the malicious intentions of his enemies in a way she could only begin to comprehend. "Are you afraid?" she asked again, her voice a whisper that barely disturbed the still air. He was silent for a long time, the only sound the low, incessant hum of the thawing streams winding their way through the valley. He finally looked at her, his green eyes reflecting the dying light, a profound melancholy in their depths. "I'm not afraid of him, Ilara," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm afraid of myself. I'm afraid of what I'll do to protect you. I'm afraid of losing control, of letting that old darkness consume me again. I'm afraid of losing this." His gaze swept over the cabin, over the land they had worked so hard to make their own, over their small, fragile world. She knew precisely what he meant. He was afraid of losing the peace he had found, the chance at redemption, the quiet, unspoken hope that had bloomed in his heart. He was afraid of becoming the monster he had once been, of breaking the trust they had built. She reached out and took his hand, her touch a source of profound comfort, a silent anchor in his internal storm. "You won't lose it, Jed, because I'll be here, and so will Liam. We'll be here to remind you of the man you are, the good man, the one who saved us, the one who cares." A single tear, a familiar sign of his deep vulnerability, traced a path down his weathered cheek. He squeezed her hand, his grip a silent promise, a binding vow. They would face the dawn together, united against the encroaching darkness. The final confrontation was coming, a crucible of their new life, and they would not be broken. They would fight for their home, for their family, and for the chance at a new life, a life free from the ghosts of their past. The dawn came not with a gentle, rosy blush across the horizon, but with the brutal, jarring clatter of hooves muffled by the mud and the low, menacing growl of men, a sound that carried across the pre-dawn stillness like a promise of violence. Silas Thorne had made good on his sinister promise. He had brought an army, a motley but numerous crew of hardened men, their intent as clear as the icy air. The valley, still shrouded in the lingering tendrils of morning mist, was suddenly thick with the pungent smell of wet earth, churned by countless boots and hooves, mixed with the acrid metallic tang of gunpowder. A grim, suffocating scent of impending doom. Jed had been meticulously right. Silas, ever the coward, had chosen to strike with the sunrise when the world was still groggy and vulnerable. But Jed and Ilara had been ready, their senses sharpened by weeks of vigilance. Jed had stayed awake all night, a silent sentinel, his body a coiled spring of readiness, every muscle taut. Ilara, though she had slept fitfully, her rest broken by 100 imagined threats, had been startled awake by the undeniable sounds of the approaching enemy, the chilling crescendo of their arrival. She came out of the cabin, the heavy rifle clutched tightly in her hands, her face a mask of fierce, unyielding determination, her breath misting in the frigid air. Jed was already positioned behind a thick, well-stacked pile of logs, his rifle at the ready, his green eyes scanning the tree line with a predatory focus. Liam was safely inside, hidden beneath a heavy blanket in the secret cellar Jed had painstakingly dug weeks ago, a small dark haven from the impending storm. "Stay here," Jed said, his voice a low, urgent whisper that cut through the encroaching noise. "Don't move until I tell you. Don't show yourself." His command was not a suggestion. It was an imperative, born of desperate necessity. Silas Thorne rode at the very front of his men, a large, powerful figure astride a black horse, a smug, cruel smile twisting his lips. He was a man who loved power, who savored the fear he inspired, and he was clearly reveling in this moment of perceived triumph. "Jedediah Stone," he bellowed, his voice echoing across the valley, a challenge and a taunt. "I'm here for my land, and I'm here for you, you coward. Come out and face me like a man." Jed didn't move a muscle. He just watched, his green eyes burning with a cold, steady fire. A fire that promised retribution. He was a hunter, and he was patiently waiting for his prey to make the first fatal move. "Don't be a fool, Elara," Silas yelled, his voice now a more insidious plea, aimed directly at the widow. "He's a dangerous man. He'll get you and your boy killed. Give me the land, and I'll give you a new life, a safe life, one without a murderer at your side." Elara didn't say anything. She just gripped her rifle tighter, her knuckles white, her resolve unshaken. She was not a fool. She knew a lie when she heard one, and Silas's words were poisoned with deceit. The tension was a palpable thing, a heavy presence in the air that seemed to press down on them. The standoff was a brutal test of wills. Silas was used to men cowering before him, but Jed was not a man to be cowed. He was a mountain, an immovable force. Finally, Silas's meager patience snapped. "Go!" he roared to his men, his voice cracking with frustrated rage. "Get them! Burn them out if you have to." The men charged, a disorganized but determined wave, their boots sinking into the wet, clinging mud. They were a motley crew of hired guns and ruffians, but they had numbers on their side, a numerical advantage that was hard to ignore. Jed took the first shot. It was a perfect shot, a clean, precise hit that spoke of years of practice and an unwavering hand. One of the men went down with a guttural cry, his rifle flying from his hands to land with a splash in the mud. The remaining men hesitated for a crucial moment, surprised by the sudden, deadly accuracy of the shot. But it was only a moment. They quickly spread out, using the trees, the thick underbrush, and the undulating terrain for cover, their own rifles now barking in response. Jed was a master marksman, and he was picking them off one by one, each shot a testament to his skill and his grim determination. But they were too many. He was outnumbered, and the sheer volume of their fire was beginning to take its toll. Elara was not a passive observer. She was a silent partner, a ghost in the woods. She used her intimate knowledge of the land, her meticulous training from Jed, to her advantage. She moved silently through the trees, a small deadly shadow, her movements fluid and purposeful. She was a woman of peace, yes, but she was fighting for her home, for her son, for the life they had painstakingly built. She was a force to be reckoned with, a fury unleashed. She took her first shot, her hands steady, her aim true, the target a fleeting glimpse of a man between two ponderosa pines. One of Silas's men went down, a look of surprise, then vacant understanding, on his face as he hit the muddy ground. She felt a sickening wave of nausea, a visceral reaction to taking a life, but she ruthlessly pushed it down. This was a war, and she was a soldier, protecting her own. The battle raged on, a brutal ballet of violence and survival. Jed was a one-man army, a force of nature. He was a blur of motion, a man who had been pushed to his limits, a man who was fighting not just for his life, but for the lives of the people he had come to love, the fragile family he had sworn to protect. But as the sun rose higher in the sky, burning off the mist, a new kind of dread settled over her, chilling her to the bone. Jed, for all his superhuman strength, was also a man. He was taking hit after hit, his body a canvas of fresh bruises and bleeding cuts. He was tiring, visibly slowing, and they were still too many, a relentless wave threatening to overwhelm him. She saw Silas, a smug, cruel smile still plastered on his face, watching from a safe distance, a true coward. A puppet master pulling the strings of violence. He was a man who let others fight his battles for him, reveling in the chaos he created. Elara knew then, with a crystal clarity that pierced through the roar of the battle, what she had to do. She had to take him out. He was the head of the snake, and if she could cut off the head, the rest of the body would surely fall into disarray. She crept through the woods, her heart pounding a furious rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat of destiny. She was a ghost, a shadow, moving with a singular, desperate focus. She was a woman who had once been a city girl, delicate and naive, and now she was a warrior in the wilderness. She was a part of the land, and the land was a part of her, guiding her every step. She raised her rifle, her eye squinting down the barrel, aligning the sights with the cruel, confident face of Silas Thorne. She had one shot, one chance to end this, to save Jed, to save Liam, to save their future. She had to make it count. She was fighting for her home, for her son, and for the man who had shown her that even a monster could be a hero, a man worth fighting for with every fiber of her being. The world narrowed to a single searing point of focus. Silas Thorne's cruel, triumphant smile etched onto his face as he surveyed the battle. He was an easy target, a man so utterly sure of his victory, so intoxicated by the power of his hired guns, that he had become careless, his guard down. Ilara's finger tightened on the trigger, the cold metal a stark contrast to the burning resolve in her heart. Her mind was a blank slate, emptied of all doubt, filled only with the chilling, absolute necessity of the moment. She had to do this, for Liam's innocent future, for Jed's life bleeding out on the muddy ground, for herself, for the dignity of their home. The justification was ironclad, the path clear. Just as her finger began to exert the final pressure, a voice, a raw, low and menacing growl, filled the smoke-laden air, cutting through the din of sporadic gunfire and shouts. "No!" Jed's voice, a raw cry of pain and desperate command, sliced through the battle sharper than any blade. "Don't, Ilara, don't become a killer. Don't let him make you like me." His words hit her with the force of a physical blow, reverberating through her very bones. Her finger, poised to deliver death, hesitated, trembling uncontrollably on the trigger. She looked at Jed, his massive frame a whirlwind of desperate defense, fighting off two of Silas's remaining men, a look of profound anguish and desperation etched onto his bruised and bloodied face. He was not just fighting for his life in that moment. He was fighting for her soul, for the last vestiges of her innocence, for the purity of the new life they had struggled to build. The momentary distraction, Ilara's agonizing hesitation, was all Silas Thorne needed. His cruel smile widened, a predatory gleam entering his eyes. He raised his pistol, a cold, calculating look replacing his previous arrogance. He wasn't aiming for Jed, who was still locked in a desperate struggle. He was aiming for her, the woman who had dared to defy him, the woman who had ignited the fire in Jed's heart. "Goodbye, little widow," he sneered, a cruel, triumphant venom dripping from his words, his finger tightening on his own trigger. A loud, deafening shot rang out, a sound that echoed across the valley, silencing all other noise, then bouncing off the surrounding peaks. But it wasn't a shot from Silas's gun. It was a shot from Jed's rifle, fired with an impossible speed and accuracy, even as he fought. Silas Thorne went down, a look of utter shock, then disbelief, then nothingness on his face. The battle, abruptly and violently, was over. The snake was dead, its head severed. The remaining men, a motley crew of hired thugs and opportunistic drifters, looked at each other in stunned silence, their leader gone, their purpose dissolved. They didn't have the stomach for a fight without their master, without the promise of his money or the fear of his wrath. Their brief bravado evaporated, replaced by a desperate self-preservation instinct. They turned and ran, scattering like frightened rabbits into the dense woods, disappearing into the cover of the trees, leaving the muddy valley in a sudden, profound and eerie silence. The only sounds were the distant chirping of birds, slowly returning to the quieted landscape, and the ragged breaths of Jed and Ilara. Jed, bruised and bleeding from countless scrapes and blows, his body screaming in protest, stumbled towards Ilara. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a complex mixture of immense relief that she was safe, and a deep unspoken sadness, a self-loathing that always accompanied the violence he was forced to enact. "I told you," he said, his voice a low, heavy rumble, thick with emotion and exhaustion. "I told you I couldn't control myself. I told you I was too big for your world. I had to do it. I couldn't let him kill you. Not you. Not Liam." A single tear, large and glistening, a familiar sign of his profound vulnerability, traced a path down his weathered, blood-streaked cheek. He had done what he had to do, yes, but it had come at a heavy, familiar cost to his soul. He was a killer, and he had killed for her, for them, and that truth would forever be a part of him. Ilara didn't say anything, words failing her in the face of such raw emotion and brutal reality. She just dropped her rifle, the heavy metal clattering against the muddy ground, and ran to him, wrapping her arms around his massive, trembling body. He was bruised and battered, his strength visibly depleted, but he was alive. He was her hero, her protector, perhaps even a monster in the eyes of the law. But to her, he was the man who had given everything, who had sacrificed a piece of himself for their survival. "You're not a monster, Jed," she said, her voice filled with a fierce determination, a conviction that resonated deep in her soul. "You're a hero. You saved us. You saved me. And I'm not afraid of you. I'll never be afraid of you, not for a single moment." He held her close, his body shaking with exhaustion and the lingering tremors of adrenaline and profound emotion. He had been a man who had fought for himself, a man who had lived his life in isolation, constantly on the run from his past. But now, for the first time, he had someone to fight for, someone to live for. He had a family, a fragile, hard-won family. They stood there for a long time, in the immediate aftermath of the battle, two souls who had found each other in a world of violence and chaos, their shared embrace a defiant statement against the darkness. The sun, a golden orb now rising triumphantly in the clear sky, was a symbol of a new beginning, washing away the shadows of the night. The Thor, which had brought death and destruction, had also ushered in a new chapter, bringing life and a chance at a new future, free from Silas Thorn's oppressive shadow. They were no longer just a widow and a drifter. They were a family, forged in fire and bound by an unbreakable love. They were a force of nature, a testament to the power of love, resilience, and hard-won redemption. They had faced the deepest darkness, and they had won. The story of their struggle was over, its violent pages turned. The story of their new life, built on a foundation of sacrifice and unwavering devotion, was just beginning. The silence that followed the battle was profound and eerie, a stark contrast to the chaos that had just consumed the valley. It was a silence that buzzed with the echoes of gunfire and desperate shouts, a heavy blanket that muffled all natural sound. The valley, which had just been a grim battlefield, was now a quiet, tranquil landscape once more, the only undeniable signs of the recent violence being the churned, muddy earth, the scattered boots and discarded weapons of the fleeing men, and the stark, chilling presence of Silas Thorn's lifeless body, alongside his most loyal thugs. The air itself seemed thick, heavy with the lingering scent of gunpowder, damp earth, and the metallic tang of fresh blood, a grim, potent reminder of the terrible price of their hard-won victory. Jed, bruised and utterly exhausted, his body aching from the punishing fight, began the grim task of carefully moving the bodies. He worked with a solemn, almost ritualistic respect, ensuring each man was given a proper, if hurried, burial in the cold, wet ground. He dug shallow graves with a heavy shovel, his muscles protesting with every movement. But he did not falter. He was a man who had seen death up close, intimately familiar with its cold embrace, and he treated the fallen with a grim reverence, even when they had been his enemies. He was not a man who reveled in violence. He was a man who used it as a last, desperate resort, and the act of burying those he had killed was a heavy penance for his soul. Ilara watched him from a distance, her heart filled with a complex, swirling mix of emotions. Immense gratitude for their survival, deep sorrow for the lives lost, and a profound understanding of the man he truly was. She saw beyond the brutal necessity of his actions, beyond the killer to the good man at his core, the man burdened by the weight of what he had done. She saw the guilt and the pain in his eyes, a silent, eloquent testament to the heavy burden he carried. When he was finally done, his clothes torn and caked with mud and dried blood, he came back to the cabin. Ilara had already prepared a basin of warm water, heated on the still smouldering embers of the hearth, and a stack of clean bandages, torn from old linens. She knelt before him, her hands gentle as she began to clean his wounds, the deep gashes, the angry red welts, the swollen bruises that blossomed across his powerful frame. The tenderness of her touch was a stark contrast to the brutal reality of his injuries. "You saved me, Jed," she said, her voice a low, heartfelt whisper, filled with a gratitude so profound it felt like a prayer. "You saved all of us. You faced down death for us." He winced as she cleaned a particularly deep cut on his arm, but he didn't pull away. He surrendered to her care, a rare moment of vulnerability for a man who had always stood alone. "I did what I had to do, Ilara," he said, his voice a low, heavy rumble strained with exhaustion. "I told you I'm a man who can't control myself, who fights when he needs to. I saw him with that gun, aiming for you, and I knew I had to stop him. There was no other choice." "You weren't out of control, Jed," she said, her voice firm, unwavering in its conviction. She looked directly into his eyes, willing him to believe her. You were in control. You were a protector. You were a hero. You made a choice and you chose us. You chose life, not death, when it mattered most. He looked at her then, his eyes filled with a new kind of light, a fragile, hopeful flicker she hadn't seen before. Her words had reached him, a small, fragile beacon cutting through the darkness of his soul, confirming the man he yearned to be. She finished cleaning his wounds and wrapped them carefully in fresh bandages, her touch lingering. She then made him a cup of hot coffee, its earthy aroma filling the small cabin, and they sat by the fire, the silence between them no longer heavy with tension, but a comfortable, shared space, a testament to their unbreakable bond. Liam, who had been hidden safely in the secret cellar throughout the entire terrifying ordeal, finally emerged, cautiously climbing the steps into the main room. His small round face was pale, still etched with a child's innocent fear, and his eyes were wide, taking in the scene. He saw Jed, bruised and bloody, leaning heavily by the fire, and his little face crumpled with fresh worry. "Jed?" he said, his voice a small, terrified whisper barely audible. Jed looked at the boy, and all the weariness and pain on his face instantly vanished, replaced by a deep, abiding love that softened his harsh features. He opened his arms, and Liam ran into them without hesitation, burying his face in Jed's chest, seeking comfort and safety. "I'm okay, little man," Jed said, his voice a low, gentle rumble, a soothing balm. "I'm okay. The bad men are gone now. We're safe. Everything's safe." Liam nodded, his small body still shaking with residual fear, but already drawing immense comfort from Jed's solid embrace. Jed held him for a long time, a silent promise of protection in his powerful arms. The three of them, a small, fragile family, had survived the storm, both the natural and the man-made. They had faced the darkness, and they had emerged victorious. That night, as Ilara lay in bed, listening to the gentle crackle of the fire and the rhythmic breathing of Jed and Liam, she felt a profound sense of peace that she hadn't experienced in a long, dark time. The cabin, once a symbol of her grief, her isolation, and her overwhelming fear, was now a symbol of her strength, her resilience, and the new life she had found. The world, once a place of terrifying uncertainty and devastating loss, was now transformed into a place of hope and redemption. The road ahead would not be easy, she knew that. They would have to live with the ghosts of the past, with the knowledge of what had happened in the valley, with the scars, both visible and invisible, that they now carried. But they would face it together. They were a family, a true family, forged in fire and bound by an unbreakable bond, and they were stronger than any storm that could come their way. The battle was over. The deep, necessary healing was just beginning. The days and weeks that followed the final showdown were a strange period of quiet recovery. The Thor, a wild and unpredictable force, had turned the valley into a muddy, impassable mess, and they were effectively cut off from the rest of the world. It was a blessing in disguise. The isolation gave them time to heal, to process the violence they had witnessed, and to find a new, quieter rhythm to their lives. The silence that had once felt oppressive now felt like a balm, a much-needed respite from the chaos they had endured. They moved through their days with a gentle, unspoken understanding, a shared history that needed no words. Jed's physical wounds were healing, and his bruises were fading, but the invisible wounds, the ones in his soul, were taking longer to mend. He was a man who had spent his life carrying his burdens alone, a solitary figure in a vast, empty landscape. He was now struggling to accept the shared responsibility of a family, the weight of a love that was a new and terrifying thing. He was still quiet, still a man of few words, but there was a new kind of peace in his silence. He was no longer running from his past. He was facing it head-on. He was a man who had killed, but he was also a man who had saved. He was a complex, contradictory person, and Ilara found herself falling deeper in love with the man he was, flaws and all. She saw the pain in his eyes, the deep-seated shame that had been his constant companion for years, and she loved him for it. She loved him for the man he was, and for the man he was trying to be. But the peace was a fragile thing. and it was soon threatened by a new kind of fear. One afternoon, as they were working in the yard, a rider appeared on the horizon, a lone figure silhouetted against the setting sun. It was a man in a black coat, his face a grim mask. Jed's jaw tightened, and he instinctively reached for the axe at his belt, his body tensing for a fight. "It's the sheriff," he said, his voice a low growl, a rumble of a coming storm. "He's come for me." Ilara's heart sank. She had been so consumed by their own world, their own little bubble of safety, that she had forgotten about the law, about the world outside their valley. Jed was a wanted man, a man who had killed, and the law would not be forgiving. She had heard the stories of Sheriff Grant, a man known for his grim resolve and his unwavering commitment to the law. He rode up to the cabin, his face a mixture of grim duty and a deep, abiding sympathy. He dismounted and looked at Jed, his eyes filled with a new kind of respect. "Jedediah Stone," he said, his voice low and serious, "I'm here for you. The word's out. Silas Thorne is dead, and I have to take you in." Jed didn't say anything. He just looked at the sheriff, his green eyes calm and steady. He knew this day would come. He had made his peace with it. He had a brief moment of hope, a hope that had been shattered by the arrival of this man. He knew he had to face the consequences of his actions. "He didn't do anything wrong, Sheriff," Ilara said, her voice filled with a fierce determination. "He was defending himself. He was defending us. Silas and his men came here to kill us. Jed saved our lives." The sheriff sighed, a deep, weary sound that spoke of a lifetime of seeing the law fall short of justice. "I believe you, ma'am. I do. But the law is the law, and I have to take him in. Silas Thorne had a lot of friends in high places. They'll want justice, and they'll want it from a man they can see." Jed placed a hand on Ilara's shoulder, a silent warning. "It's okay, Ilara. He's just doing his job. I'll go with him." Ilara looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "No, Jed. I won't let you. You're not a criminal. You're a hero. We'll fight this. We'll tell them the truth." Jed just shook his head, a gesture of resignation. "The truth doesn't matter, Ilara. Not in a court of law. Not when a man like Silas is on the other side. They'll just twist it. They'll make me out to be a monster, a wild animal who can't be tamed, and they'll take me away from you and Liam. I can't let that happen." He looked at the sheriff, a silent plea in his eyes. "Sheriff, can we go now?" "I don't want to make a scene. I don't want the boy to see this." The sheriff nodded, his face a grim mask of understanding. He had seen too much. He knew that the law was a cruel, unforgiving thing. He knew that a man like Jed was no match for a system that was stacked against him. He knew that some battles, no matter how righteous, were impossible to win. But just as Jed was about to climb on the horse, a small voice cut through the silence, a sound that was more powerful than any weapon. "Jed, no!" Liam said, his voice filled with a child's innocent terror. "Don't go! Don't leave us!" Jed stopped, his body frozen. He looked at the small boy, and all the resolve in his body crumbled. He was a man who could face an army, a man who could face down a monster, but he was no match for a child's love. He walked over to Liam, his face filled with a deep, abiding sadness. He knelt down and wrapped his arms around the boy. "I'll be okay, little man," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "I'll be back, I promise. I'll never leave you." He stood up and looked at Ilara, his eyes filled with a silent plea. "I have to do this, Ilara. I have to face my past. I have to do this alone. It's the only way." She knew he was right. He was a man of honor, and he had to face the consequences of his actions. She just nodded, her eyes filled with tears. She watched as Jed rode off with the sheriff, a solitary figure in the vast, empty landscape. She was alone again, but she was not broken. She was a woman who had found her strength, and she would fight for the man who had given her a new life, a new purpose. She would tell his story. She would make sure the world knew the truth. She would fight for him, just as he had fought for her. She was not a victim. She was a warrior, and she would not be defeated. The days that followed Jed's departure were a blur of frenetic activity. Ilara had to go into town, a place she had once avoided, a place she now had to face with a newfound resolve. She had to face the people who had looked down on her, the people who had believed the lies of Silas Thorne. She had to tell them the truth, to make them see the man Jed really was, to give him a voice he was too humble to use for himself. Her grief and fear were transformed into a fierce determination. She was no longer just a spectator in her own life. She was a participant, a warrior in a war she had never asked for. The trial was a circus, a public spectacle designed for entertainment as much as justice. The courtroom was packed with people, all of them there to see the mountain man who had killed Silas Thorne. The air was thick with prejudice and gossip. Jed was a pariah, a man of violence and a killer in their eyes. And Ilara was the woman who had brought him into their world, a woman who had been foolish enough to trust a stranger. The prosecutor, a slick, self-important man with a penchant for dramatics, was a friend of Silas's, a man who saw this as an opportunity for personal glory. He painted a picture of Jed as a wild, uncontrollable beast, a man who had murdered a respected landowner for his own gain. He twisted the facts, he manipulated the evidence, and he made Jed out to be a monster, a danger to the entire community. He spoke of Jed's past, of his reputation for violence, and he made it sound as if Jed had been looking for a fight all along. Jed sat there silent and stoic, his face a grim mask of resignation. He didn't speak. He didn't defend himself. He was a man who had faced the world alone for too long, and he was not used to fighting with words. He was used to fighting with his hands, with his instincts. His silence was a source of frustration for Ilara, but she knew it was a part of who he was. He was a man who believed that his actions should speak for themselves, but in a court of law, that was a fatal mistake. He was a man who had been misunderstood his entire life, and he had come to expect it. Ilara watched him, her heart aching. She knew she had to fight for him. She had to be his voice, his advocate, his warrior. When it was her turn to testify, she walked to the stand, her body straight, her head held high. She looked at the judge, a stern, unyielding man, and she looked at the jury, their faces filled with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. She took a deep breath and she began to speak. "My name is Ilara Vance," she said, her voice clear and strong, a bell in the silent courtroom. "And I'm here to tell you the truth. The man you see before you is not a monster. He is a hero. He saved my life. He saved my son's life." She told them the whole story. She told them about the blizzard, about Silas's threats, about the fear she had felt. She told them about the man who had appeared out of the storm, a man who was not a monster, but a protector. She told them about the lessons he had taught her, about the way he had cared for her son, about the man who had faced down an army to protect them. The prosecutor tried to interrupt her, to discredit her, to twist her words, but she didn't let him. She was a woman on a mission, a woman who had found her voice, a woman who was fighting for the man she loved. "He told me he was too big for my world, but he couldn't control himself," she said, her voice filled with a deep, abiding love. He was right. He couldn't control the kindness in his heart. He couldn't control the love he felt for a boy who had lost his father. He couldn't control his need to protect. He is not a killer, he is a hero, and I will stand by him no matter what. A silence fell over the courtroom, a silence so profound that you could hear a pin drop. The jury, the judge, the people in the gallery, all of them were listening. They had seen the angry, vengeful man the prosecutor had painted, and now they were seeing a different man, a man of honor, a man of love. Jed looked at her, his green eyes filled with a mixture of awe and gratitude. Her words had reached him, her love had reached him. He was no longer just a man in a courtroom, he was a hero in a story, and the story was finally being told. The trial was far from over, but Ilara had planted a seed of doubt in the minds of the jury. She had given them a new story, a new narrative. She had given them the truth, and she knew that the truth, when spoken with love and conviction, was the most powerful weapon of all. The waiting was the hardest part. The trial had ended, the closing arguments delivered, and now all that was left was the agonizing silence of the deliberation room. Ilara spent the next few days in a state of nervous anticipation, pacing her small hotel room, replaying her testimony in her mind, her heart a tangled knot of hope and fear. She had done all she could. She had told the truth, a truth that she hoped was enough to counteract the lies and the prejudice that had been stacked against Jed. The rest was up to the jury, 12 people who held Jed's fate in their hands. Jed was a prisoner, but he was also a man who had found his peace. He was in a small, cramped cell, but he was not alone. He had the memory of Ilara's testimony, of her words, of her love. He had found his redemption, and he was no longer a man running from his past. He was a man who had faced his demons, and he was ready for whatever came his way. He was no longer afraid of death or imprisonment. He was only afraid of losing the love he had found. The day of the verdict arrived, a cold and grey morning that mirrored the tension in the air. The courtroom was silent, a tense, expectant hush hanging in the air. The jury filed in, their faces grim and unreadable. The judge, a stern and unyielding man, looked at the jury foreman. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" he asked, his voice low and serious, a sound that echoed in the silent room. "Yes, Your Honor," the foreman said, his voice trembling slightly. Ilara's heart stopped. She looked at Jed, who was a statue of calm and resolve. He had made his peace with his fate, whatever it was. He was a man who had lived his life on his own terms, and he would die on his own terms. "On the charge of murder, how do you find the defendant, Jedediah Stone?" the judge asked. The world seemed to stop. The air was thick with a collective breath held. "Not guilty," the foreman said, his voice clear and firm, a sound that broke the silence like a thunderclap. A gasp went through the courtroom, a collective exhale of surprise. Ilara's body went limp with relief. She felt a wave of dizziness, and she had to lean on the railing to keep herself from falling. The prosecutor, a look of shock on his face, was on his feet, protesting, but the judge silenced him with a stern glance. "The defendant is free to go," the judge said, his voice now a little softer, a little more human. Jed just sat there for a moment, the words sinking in. He was a free man. He was no longer a criminal. He was no longer a fugitive. He was a man who had found his redemption. He looked at Ilara, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across his face. It was a smile that reached his eyes, a smile that was full of gratitude and love and a deep, abiding joy. He walked out of the courtroom, a free man. Ilara ran to him, and he wrapped his arms around her, a tight, powerful embrace that spoke of all the words that had gone unsaid. "You did it, Ilara," he said, his voice a low, emotional rumble. "You saved me." "No, Jed," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You saved yourself. You were the hero. I was just the storyteller. I just told them the truth of a good man." He held her for a long time, and the world outside the courtroom melted away. It was just the two of them, a man who had been a killer and a woman who had been a widow, and they had found each other. They had found their home. The journey was over. The battle was won. And the final chapter of their story, the one where they would live a life of peace, a life of love, was just beginning. The news of the verdict traveled faster than the fastest horse in the West. It spread like wildfire, carried by every rider, every trapper, and every trader who passed through the valley. The acquittal of Jedediah Stone became the talk of every saloon, every general store, and every ranch. A man who had been a pariah, a killer in the public eye, was now a free man, a hero in the eyes of many. The power of Ilara's testimony, her raw honesty and unwavering belief, had swayed a jury that had come in with a verdict already decided. It was a story that would be told for generations, a story of a woman who had saved a man's life with her words. As Jed and Ilara left the courtroom, they were met not with jeers but with a respectful silence. A few people, the ones who had been touched by the story, nodded at them, a silent acknowledgement of their struggle. The world was beginning to see the man, not the monster. They made their way back to the cabin, the journey a quiet, reflective one. The snow was beginning to melt, revealing the rich, dark earth beneath. The air was filled with the scent of pine and a new, unspoken promise. They were no longer running, they were going home. When they arrived, Liam was waiting for them on the porch, his small round face filled with an innocent hope. He saw Jed, and his face lit up with a brilliant smile. He ran into Jed's arms, a silent embrace that spoke more than words ever could. Jed held him for a long time, his eyes filled with a new kind of peace. He had faced his demons, he had paid his dues, and he was home. He was a free man, but more importantly, he was a father, a husband, a protector. The three of them went inside, and for the first time in a long time, the cabin was a place of unburdened joy. The fear was gone, the tension had evaporated, and all that remained was the warmth of the fire, the love of a family, and the promise of a new dawn. The next few days were a blur of work and quiet celebration. The land, once a place of fear, was now a place of possibility. They worked together, side by side, building a new fence, planting a small garden, and making the cabin a true home. Jed was a different man now. The grim, stoic exterior was still there, but it was softened by a new kind of peace. He smiled more often, he laughed more freely, and he was more open with his feelings. He was no longer a man running from his past. He was a man building a future. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the day's work done, Ilara looked at him, her heart filled with a profound love. "What will you do now, Jed?" she asked, her voice soft. "You're a free man. You can go anywhere you want." He looked at her, his green eyes filled with a new kind of light. "I'm not going anywhere, Ilara," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "My home is here. My family is here. My life is with you." He reached out and took her hand, his grasp strong and reassuring. "I told you I was too big for your world, but I couldn't control myself. I was right. I couldn't control my need to protect you. I couldn't control my love for you. I was a man lost in the mountains, but you were the compass that led me home." A single tear, a sign of his vulnerability, traced a path down her cheek. She was a woman who had lost her world, and she had found a new one in the most unlikely of places. She had found a home, a love and a family. The story of her sorrow was over. The story of her new life was just beginning. The spring, vibrant and full of life, had fully arrived, transforming the Vance Ranch into a bustling hive of activity. Jed, a man whose colossal hands were once a force of raw, untamed power, now used them as instruments of creation. He was a natural builder, his strength and his innate understanding of the land, making him an architect of their new life. Each morning the rhythmic thud of his hammer echoed across the valley, a sound of progress and permanence. He repaired the fences that had been broken by the winter storms, rebuilt the barn that had fallen into disrepair, and constructed a new, sturdy chicken coop with a precision that belied his size. The work was tireless, but in it, Jed found a profound sense of purpose. He was no longer just surviving, he was building a legacy, a foundation for the family he had so unexpectedly found. He worked from dawn till dusk, his face streaked with sweat and dirt, but his eyes held a peace that had been absent for a lifetime. He was a man who had finally found a place to anchor his restless spirit. Ilara was his partner in every sense of the word. She worked alongside him, her hands once soft and unused to labor, now calloused and strong. She had found a resilience she never knew she possessed, a spirit that had been buried under grief and fear. She learned to mend clothing with a needle and thread, to preserve food for the coming winter, and to nurture the small, fragile garden they had planted. She was no longer a city girl, a stranger in a strange land. She was a woman of the West, a rancher, a force of nature in her own right. Their work was a silent ballet of shared purpose. They moved in perfect synchronization, a testament to the deep, unspoken bond that had formed between them. The work was hard, but it was a labor of love, a daily act of building their future. The most profound and beautiful change, however, was in the family dynamic. Jed was no longer just a protector who stood guard from a distance. He was an active, loving father to Liam. He taught the boy to ride a horse, his massive hand holding Liam's small one on the reins, his voice a low, reassuring rumble. He taught him to fish in the creek, his immense patience a guiding force as Liam learned to cast a line. He taught him to track animals in the woods, showing him how to read the subtle signs of the forest, the broken twigs, the footprints in the mud. He was a patient and gentle teacher, a side of him that Ilara had only seen in rare, fleeting moments. Liam, in turn, adored him. He no longer asked if he was a giant, he just knew he was his hero, a living, breathing legend from his storybooks. He would follow Jed everywhere, a small shadow to the large, silent man. The bond between them was a testament to the power of love and redemption, a story of a boy who had lost his father and a man who had found his purpose in a child's love. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Watching the sun paint the sky with strokes of orange and purple, Liam, in a voice as soft as a whisper, turned to Jed. "Are you my new daddy?" The question, so simple and so profound, hung in the air. Jed's body went still, and a look of profound emotion, of fear and of hope, crossed his face. He looked at Ilara, a silent question in his eyes. She just smiled and nodded, her eyes filled with tears. She knew that this was a moment of truth, a moment of acceptance. Jed, a man who had lived his life alone, was being offered a new life, a new identity. He turned back to Liam and knelt down, his massive frame dwarfing the small boy. "I can't replace your daddy, little man," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "He was a good man and he'll always be your daddy. But I'll be here. I'll be here to protect you. I'll be here to teach you. I'll be here to love you. If you want me to, I can be your guardian." Liam's face lit up with a brilliant smile. "Okay, Jed, you can be my guardian." He wrapped his small arms around Jed's neck, a hug that spoke of a child's love and acceptance. Jed held him for a long time, his eyes closed, a silent prayer on his lips. He was no longer a lost soul. He was a man who had found his way home, a man who had found his purpose in a small boy's hug. The family was not a traditional one, but it was a family built on a foundation of love, trust, and a shared history of struggle and survival. They had faced the darkness, and they had won. They were a testament to the fact that a new life could be built from the ashes of the old. The future was bright, and the past was just a story they would tell their grandchildren, a story of how a man who was too big for his world found a home in the heart of a small boy. The peace they had so carefully built was a fragile thing, and it was soon put to the test. A few months into their new life, a group of riders appeared on the horizon, a sight that still sent a jolt of fear through Ilara's heart. She reached for the rifle, her body tensing, her mind racing with 100 different scenarios. She had thought the days of conflict were over, but the West was a wild and unpredictable place, and a woman on a lonely ranch could never be too careful. As the riders drew closer, however, she saw that they were not a threat. They were a group of trappers and traders, rugged men with weathered faces and a deep respect for the man they called the Mountain Man. They had heard the story of Jed's trial, of Ilara's powerful testimony, and they had come to see the legend for themselves. Their presence wasn't menacing. It was one of genuine curiosity and admiration. "Jedediah Stone!" one of the men boomed, a wide, genuine smile on his face. "We heard you're a free man. We heard you're a hero." Jed just nodded, a small, weary smile on his face. He was not a man who enjoyed the spotlight, but he understood the respect in their voices. The men dismounted, their eyes filled with a mixture of awe and respect. They had heard the whispers of Jed's strength, of his reputation, but they had never seen it in person. Now they were seeing the man who had faced down an army and lived to tell the tale, a man who was a living, breathing legend. They had heard the story of a man who was too big for his world, a man who couldn't control himself, and they had come to see if the story was true. "I brought you some gifts, Jed," another man said, handing him a large sack filled with tobacco, flour, and coffee. "A small token of our respect. A small thank you for teaching us that a man can find a new life, a new purpose." Jed was a man of few words, but his gratitude was immense. He took the gifts, his eyes filled with a new kind of light. He was no longer a man who had to live off the land, a man who had to fight for every meal. He was a man who had a community, a tribe of his own. He was no longer an outsider. He was one of them, a man who was a part of something larger than himself. As the men were leaving, one of them, a grizzled old trapper with a face like a road map of the West, looked at Ilara. "You're a brave woman, ma'am," he said, his voice filled with a deep respect. "We all heard your testimony. You saved that man's life, and you gave us all a reason to believe in something good." Ilara just smiled, her eyes filled with tears. She had done what she had to do, and in doing so she had not just saved a man, she had saved herself. The visit from the trappers was a turning point. Jed was no longer just a man in a small cabin, a man who was feared and respected from a distance. He was a part of a larger community. He was a man who had a reputation, but it was a reputation built on honor, not on violence. The visit had a profound effect on him. It was a silent acknowledgement of his redemption, a testament to the fact that his actions had not gone unnoticed. He was a man who had found his way home, and he was a man who was now a part of something larger than himself. The family was a testament to the power of a new beginning. They had lost everything, but they had found something more precious than gold: a family, a home, and a purpose. They were a beacon of hope in a world of darkness, a living, breathing story of love and redemption. Their journey was not just a story of survival, it was a story of a new life, a new purpose, a new love. The trapper's visit was a small but significant moment, a sign that the world was beginning to see the truth, and a sign that their new life was a reality. The story of Jed and Ilara spread, reaching far beyond the small valley. It became a tale whispered in every saloon, shared at every homestead, and passed down from trapper to trapper. The town, which had once been a place of suspicion and hostility, was now a place of acceptance and admiration. People who had once feared Jed now sought him out, eager to shake his hand, to offer him a kind word, to thank him for what he had done. He was no longer a pariah, he was a local legend, a man who had faced down an army and lived to tell the tale. He was still a man of few words, but his presence was a source of comfort and strength for the community. He was a man who had a reputation for violence, but he had redeemed himself with an act of selflessness. Ilara was a part of this new life too. She was no longer just a widow on a lonely ranch. She was a woman of the community, a force of nature in her own right. She would go to town to trade, and people would greet her with respect and kindness. They saw the strength in her hands, the wisdom in her eyes, and they knew she was a woman who had earned her place in the world. She had stood by her man, a man who was feared and misunderstood, and she had fought for him not with a gun but with her words, with her truth. She was a woman who had found her voice, and she had used it to save a man's life. She also found a new purpose in her life. She started a small business, using her knowledge of the land to create herbal remedies and salves. Jed, with his vast knowledge of the mountains, would help her find the herbs and plants she needed, and she would create remedies that were sought after throughout the valley. Her business was a huge success. People trusted her. They saw the strength in her hands, the wisdom in her eyes, and they knew she was a woman who had earned her place in the world. Jed was her partner in every sense of the word. He would go with her to town, a silent, imposing presence at her side. He was her protector, her guardian, and her love. He was no longer a man who was too big for her world. He was a man who fit perfectly in it. The relationship between them was a quiet, deep, and abiding love. It was not a love of grand gestures or of fiery passion. It was a love built on a foundation of respect, of trust, and of a shared history. They had faced death together, and in doing so, they had found a love that was stronger than any storm. They were a family. They were a team. They were a testament to the fact that a new life could be built from the ashes of the old. The past was a part of them, a scar on their soul, but it was a scar that had healed, a scar that had made them stronger, a testament to the power of love and redemption. Their story was a beacon of hope for the entire community. A year had passed since the trial, and the valley was a different place. The land was green and lush, the crops were bountiful, and the community was thriving. The ranch, once a lonely outpost, was now a symbol of hope and resilience, a testament to the power of a new beginning. Jed and Ilara's love had deepened, and they were no longer just two people living together. They were a family, a unit bound by a love that had been forged in the fire of shared hardship. Liam was a happy, healthy boy, and he was growing up with a love that was strong and true. He had a mother who was fierce and loving, and a guardian who was a hero in every sense of the word. One afternoon, as the sun was setting, painting the sky with strokes of gold and crimson, Ilara found Jed by the small creek that ran through their property. He was a man who had spent his life alone, and he still found solace in the quiet solitude of the wilderness. She sat down beside him, her hand resting on his arm, a silent comfort. "What are you thinking about, Jed?" she asked, her voice soft, a gentle hum in the quiet air. He looked at her, his green eyes filled with a rare, quiet peace. "I'm thinking about how lucky I am, Ilara," he said, his voice a low, emotional rumble. I'm thinking about how a man who had nothing, a man who was lost, found a family. I found a home. I found you." He paused, and a single tear, a familiar sign of his vulnerability, traced a path down his weathered cheek. "I told you I was too big for your world, but I couldn't control myself. I was right. I couldn't control my love for you. I was a man who had seen too much darkness. But you brought me into the light." He pulled a small worn wooden box from his pocket. He opened it, and inside was a ring, a simple, beautiful ring made of silver and a small piece of turquoise. It was a ring he had made himself, a testament to his love and his craft. "Elara Vance," he said, his voice filled with a deep, abiding love. Will you marry me? Will you make me the luckiest man in the world?" A wave of emotion washed over her, and she felt the tears streaming down her face. She had lost so much, but she had gained everything. She had lost a husband, and she had found a love that was stronger than any storm. "Yes, Jed," she said, her voice a whisper. "Yes, I will." He slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit. It was not a ring of gold or diamonds. It was a ring of love, of trust, of a shared history. It was a symbol of their journey, a testament to the fact that a new life could be built from the ashes of the old. They stood up and held each other, their bodies a silent, loving embrace. The sun was setting, casting a golden light on the land, and the world was a silent witness to their love. They were no longer a widow and a drifter. They were a man and a woman who had found their home in each other. The years that followed were a testament to their love and to their resilience. The ranch flourished, a symbol of hope and a beacon of light in a world that could be dark and unforgiving. Jed and Elara had 2 more children, a boy and a girl, and their family was a testament to the power of a new beginning. Jed was a man who had found his purpose. He was a husband, a father, a leader in the community. He was still a man of few words, but his actions spoke louder than any words ever could. He was a man who had been a killer, but he had found his redemption. He was a man who had been a drifter, but he had found his home. He had a family, a love and a purpose that had been absent from his life for so long. He was a man who was truly home. Elara was a woman who had found her strength. She was no longer just a wife or a mother. She was a partner, a business owner, a force of nature. She was a woman who had lost her world, and she had built a new one. She was a woman who had found her voice, and she had used it to save a man's life. She was a woman who had faced her own demons and had come out on the other side, stronger and more resilient than ever before. She was a woman who was a testament to the power of love and redemption. She was a hero in every sense of the word. Liam was a happy, healthy boy, and he was growing up with a love that was strong and true. He had 2 fathers, one in his memories and one in his life. He was a boy who had lost so much, but he had gained a family that was stronger than any storm. He was a boy who would grow up to be a man of honor, a man who would carry the legacy of his 2 fathers with pride. He would be a man who would know the true meaning of love and redemption. The story of Jedediah Stone and Elara Vance became a legend in the valley, a story of a man who was too big for his world, but who couldn't control his love for a woman and her son. It was a story of a man who had been a killer, but who had found his redemption. It was a story of a woman who had lost everything, but who had found a new life, a new purpose, a new love. The cabin, once a place of sorrow and loneliness, was now a place of joy and laughter. The land, once a place of fear and despair, was now a place of hope and resilience. The West, once a place of violence and chaos, was now a place of peace and love. The final chapter of their story was not one of conflict or of tragedy, but one of a quiet, profound love. It was a story that would be told for generations, a story of a mountain man who had a heart as big as the mountains themselves, a story of a widow who had found her strength, and a story of a family that had found their home in each other. Their legacy would be a lasting one, a testament to the power of love, redemption, and a new beginning.